December 23, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. The date is etched into the annals of military history, a fulcrum point in the massive, desperate German counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge. For Sergeant James Miller, the frigid air was a physical enemy, burning in his lungs as he lay motionless in the snow. Each breath was a cloud of white vapor that he feared would betray his position. His modified M1 Garand rifle, a weapon that was both his salvation and a violation of military law, was pressed hard against his shoulder. The metal was so cold it felt like a brand, a sensation he had tried to mitigate with a makeshift leather wrapping he'd added to the stock. Through his scope, the world was reduced to a narrow, terrifying vignette. He could see the German advance, a relentless tide of field gray and steel. At least 6 Panzer tanks, their long guns menacing even at this distance, spearheaded the assault. Behind them, nearly 200 infantrymen moved with disciplined precision, a gray-green serpent winding its way toward the thinly defended American line. Miller was part of that line, or rather, just ahead of it. He was in a forward observation post, a frozen hole in the ground offering a terrifyingly clear view of the impending slaughter. The radio in the foxhole crackled, the voice on the other end strained and desperate, cutting through the static with orders that felt like a death sentence. Hold position. Wait for battalion support. Do not engage. Do not engage. The words echoed in Miller's mind, a stark contradiction to the reality unfolding in his sights. His hands, numb and aching, tightened around his rifle. His finger hovered near the trigger assembly, a piece of metal he had meticulously altered just 3 days prior. This modification was forbidden, a cardinal sin against Army regulations, a piece of engineering arrogance that could land him in a stockade. In the distance, the German tanks were now less than 800 yards away. They were closing on the American position, a meager line of 37 soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division. Men huddled in hastily dug foxholes, their breath fogging in the crushing cold. The temperature had plunged to -20 degrees, a cold so profound it slowed a man's thoughts, froze his blood, and made his weapons unreliable. Ammunition, like warmth, was running dangerously low. Behind Miller, in his own foxhole, lay a small leather pouch. It contained 8 en-bloc clips. Each held 8 rounds for his Garand, the standard-issue semi-automatic rifle that every American infantryman knew as an extension of his own body. But Miller's weapon was no longer standard. It was something else, something more. In that frozen moment, James Miller understood the gravity of his choice. Disobeying a direct order in combat, especially an order to hold fire, was unthinkable. It could end his military career. It could lead to a court-martial, to imprisonment. But following those orders? Following them meant certain death for the 37 men in those foxholes. It meant the line would break, the panzers would roll through, and this entire sector of Bastogne's defense would collapse. He took a deep, ragged breath, the air searing his lungs. He closed his eyes for a single second, a brief, silent prayer in the midst of chaos. He whispered to himself, the words lost in the wind, "God, forgive me." Then Sergeant James Miller slid his finger onto his modified trigger, took aim at the lead German officer visible in the turret of the lead tank, and initiated what would later be called the impossible defense of Bastogne's northwest perimeter. James Miller had not seemed destined for military heroism. He was not a natural-born leader or a charismatic figure. He was quiet, thoughtful, and perpetually curious about the inner workings of the world. Born on April 7, 1922, in the small, soot-stained farming community of Millfield, Ohio, he was the third of 5 children. His father, William Miller, was a man hardened by the earth, working long, dark hours in the local coal mines. His mother, Elizabeth, maintained their modest farm, a life dictated by the seasons and endless toil. Jimmy, as he was known to friends and family, was different. He developed an early and intense fascination with mechanics. He didn't just see objects, he saw systems. He saw how parts interconnected, how one small movement could create another. By the age of 10, he could disassemble and reassemble his father's pocket watch, a complex and delicate piece of machinery. This act initially earned him a stern reprimand, but as his father watched the tiny gears mesh and the second hand begin to sweep, that anger melted into a grudging, unspoken respect. When Jimmy was 12, his Uncle Thomas returned from a hunting trip with a broken rifle. The adults in the room, practical men who understood the limits of their own skills, declared it beyond repair, fit only for scrap. But young Jimmy saw a puzzle. He took the broken weapon to the family's tool shed, a place of rust and possibility. For 3 days, he was lost to the world, emerging only for meals. On the 3rd day, he emerged, the rifle functioning once again. His method was a study in battlefield improvisation, long before he'd ever seen a battlefield. He had filed down and meticulously reshaped the damaged firing pin. His tools were not those of a gunsmith, but those of a farm boy. His mother's discarded sewing needles for fine manipulation, and his father's collection of dull metal files. The solution was so unorthodox, so brilliantly simple, that the local gunsmith asked to examine it, turning the rifle over in his hands with a look of disbelief. "The boy thinks differently," the gunsmith told William. "He sees what things could be, not just what they are." This mechanical intuition, this ability to see potential, followed Jimmy through his teenage years. At Millfield High School, he was an unremarkable student. He struggled with formal academics, with the abstract theories of mathematics, and the memorization of history. But in shop class, where he could work with his hands, he was a prodigy. His mathematics teacher, a Mr. Harrison, once noted the paradox of James Miller. Jimmy could, with uncanny speed, instantly calculate trajectories and angles when building a wooden truss or aligning an engine. Yet he would stare blankly at the same concepts when they were written as equations on a chalkboard. He understood the physics of the real world, not the theory of the classroom. Jimmy's senior year, 1941, was the year the world changed. The quiet life of Millfield was shattered by the news crackling over the radio of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The abstract concepts of history and geopolitics suddenly became terrifyingly real. Within 2 months, driven by a mixture of patriotic fervor and a desire to see the larger world he had only ever read about, Jimmy and 7 of his classmates enlisted in the United States Army. He was just 19 years old. During basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, Miller's civilian skills found a new lethal application. His marksmanship immediately stood out. On his 3rd day at the firing range, he outshot every other recruit. By the end of the week, he had outshot 2 of his instructors. When asked by a bewildered officer how a farm boy from Ohio could shoot with such innate precision, Jimmy merely shrugged and offered an explanation that, to him, was perfectly logical. "It's just angles and timing, sir, like fixing a clock." This response earned him the nickname Clockwork from his drill sergeant, a name that would follow him throughout his military career. It was a name spoken with both respect for his skill and frustration at his nature. While his shooting impressed everyone, his constant, unauthorized tinkering with standard-issue equipment frustrated his superiors to no end. The Army values uniformity and reliability above all else. A soldier's equipment is designed by engineers, tested exhaustively, and issued with the explicit understanding that it is not to be altered. James Miller could not help himself. He saw what things could be. 3 times during basic training, Jimmy was disciplined for modifying standard-issue equipment. First, he was caught adjusting the sights on his rifle, claiming they were misaligned from the factory. Then, he re-engineered his backpack straps, adding new stitching and padding to distribute the weight more efficiently. Finally, and most ominously, he was caught by an armorer with his M1 rifle disassembled, carefully filing down parts of its trigger assembly to create what he called a smoother action. Each offense earned him extra duties, hours of kitchen patrol, and stern warnings about tampering with government property. But his disciplinary issues were constantly at odds with his undeniable talent. His shooting scores could not be ignored. When his training officers discovered he could consistently hit man-sized targets at 800 yards, well beyond the expected effective range for an M1 Garand, they knew he was not a standard infantryman. He was a specialist. They recommended him for specialized training. By June 1943, Private First Class James Miller was assigned to the newly formed 101st Airborne Division as a designated marksman. The 101, nicknamed the Screaming Eagles, was an elite airborne unit, a new concept in warfare. Their purpose was to parachute behind enemy lines, to sow chaos, to seize critical objectives, and to fight surrounded. Jimmy initially struggled to fit in. The paratroopers of the 101 were a fraternity, a rough-and-tumble brotherhood, many of whom had been together since the unit's formation. Miller, with his quiet, thoughtful demeanor and his constant tinkering, was an outsider. "Here comes Clockwork," soldiers would mutter when he entered the barracks, "about to break something else." His direct superior, Staff Sergeant Frank Cooper, was particularly critical. Cooper was an old Army man, a believer in regulations and the chain of command. "Miller, the Army spent millions of dollars designing that rifle," Cooper would say, pointing at the M1. "What makes you, a 19-year-old from Ohio, know better than the engineers who built it?" Jimmy would simply shrug, unable to properly articulate his intuition. "I just see what it could be, Sarge." This tension persisted throughout Jimmy's training with the 101. His marksmanship on the range earned him a grudging respect, but his modifications made others uneasy. His fellow soldiers, men who would have to trust their lives to him, worried. They worried that in the heat of combat, one of Jimmy's improvements might fail at a critical moment. Jimmy carried this skepticism with him when the 101st deployed to England in September 1943 to prepare for the invasion of Europe. Stationed at Greenham Common in Berkshire, the division underwent months of intensive, brutal training for their role in the coming invasion. Jimmy's first combat experience came during Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. In the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, Sergeant Miller, now a seasoned paratrooper, jumped with the 101st into the darkness of occupied France. The night was a blur of flak, engine noise, and terror. His unit's objective was to secure the bridges and causeway exit routes leading inland from Utah Beach, clearing the way for the seaborne forces who would land at dawn. The drop was chaotic. German anti-aircraft fire scattered the formations of C-47 transport planes. Jimmy was separated from his squad and landed hard, nearly 3 miles from his designated drop zone, alone in a field crisscrossed by German patrols. For 18 hours, he navigated by instinct and training, moving through enemy-controlled territory, a ghost in the Normandy hedgerows. During this solo journey, he encountered a 3-man German patrol. The enemy soldiers spotted him at the same moment he spotted them. There was no time for subtlety. Using his modified M1 Garand, Sergeant Miller eliminated all 3 soldiers with 3 shots in less than 5 seconds. It was a feat of marksmanship and speed that, when he later recounted it to his reunited squad, was met with disbelief. "Nobody gets off 3 aimed shots that fast with a Garand," Staff Sergeant Cooper argued, his skepticism intact even in the midst of battle. "The recoil's too much, the trigger's too slow." Jimmy simply replied, his voice quiet, "You can, Sarge. You can if you fix the trigger reset." This incident marked the beginning of a shift. In the brutal, unforgiving proving ground of Normandy, the men of the 101st began to see Miller's tinkering in a new light. They began to see it not as a violation of regulations, but as a tactical advantage. By December 1944, the legend of Sergeant Miller was growing, but it was about to be eclipsed by a legend far larger. The Allied forces, having broken out of Normandy and liberated France, had pushed deep into Europe. The German forces appeared to be on the verge of total defeat. A wave of optimism swept the front lines. Many American soldiers genuinely hoped, and wrote in their letters home, that they would be home by Christmas. This optimism, however, dangerously underestimated the German capacity for one last, titanic counteroffensive. On December 16, 1944, Adolf Hitler launched a massive surprise attack, Operation Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine. He hurled over 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks through the densely forested Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. This was a sector the Allied commanders had considered a quiet front, holding it with new, inexperienced, or battle-weary divisions. They believed the terrain was too difficult for a major German armored offensive. They were wrong. Hitler's gamble was audacious. He intended to split the Allied forces in 2, surge westward, and capture the vital port of Antwerp, cutting off the Allied supply line and trapping 4 complete armies. It was this desperate, massive assault that would become known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had been in France, recovering and refitting after their brutal campaign in the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden. They received urgent, panicked orders. They were to move immediately to the town of Bastogne, Belgium. Bastogne's strategic importance could not be overstated. The small Belgian town was a critical crossroads, a junction of 7 major roads that the German Panzers needed for their westward advance. If the Germans captured Bastogne, their path to Antwerp would be wide open. The division was transported by a frantic convoy of open-topped trucks in the bitter cold. Many soldiers, expecting a rest period, were still wearing the lighter combat uniforms from their previous deployment, completely unprepared for the Arctic conditions of the Ardennes. They arrived in Bastogne on December 19th, just as the lead elements of the German forces were beginning to encircle the town. The situation was dire. The temperature had plummeted to well below freezing. Snow covered the ground, and visibility was often reduced to less than 100 yards due to a dense, persistent fog. The American forces were significantly outnumbered. The 101st Airborne, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and various artillery units, numbered approximately 11,000 men. They were facing more than 45,000 German troops. The German advantage in armor was even more pronounced. with over 400 tanks arrayed against the Americans' limited tank destroyer units and fewer than 20 operational tanks. Medical supplies, ammunition, and food were all in critically short supply. Within 24 hours of their arrival, the American forces found themselves completely surrounded. The German forces had established a tight perimeter around Bastogne, a ring of steel stretching nearly 30 miles. On December 22nd, German emissaries approached the American lines under a flag of truce. They delivered a formal surrender ultimatum to the acting commander of the 101st Airborne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. His famous and famously blunt response was typed up and delivered back to the Germans. To the German commander, nuts from the American commander. That single word, nuts, became symbolic of the American determination to hold Bastogne at all costs. But this determination would be severely tested in the days that followed. The German High Command, infuriated by the American refusal to surrender, ordered an all-out assault on Bastogne's perimeter. Intelligence reports, gleaned from captured prisoners and desperate frontline observers, indicated that the main thrust would come from the northwest. This sector was targeting the weakest section of the American defense line, a 3-mile stretch held by elements of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. The 502nd had suffered heavy casualties in the initial German probing attacks and was now operating at less than 70% of its normal combat strength. It was here, in this most vulnerable sector, that Sergeant James Miller, now a squad leader in Charlie Company, was assigned. He was sent to a forward observation post approximately 1 mile northwest of Bastogne's center. From this position, on a small wooded rise, he had a clear, unobstructed view of the likely avenue of the German advance. With him were 2 other soldiers. Private First Class David Rodriguez, a 19-year-old replacement from New Mexico, so new his uniform still looked stiff. The other was Corporal Thomas Jenkins, a veteran paratrooper, a grizzled survivor who had jumped with Miller on D-Day. The 3 men had established their position in a hastily dug foxhole, reinforced with pine logs and covered with snow-laden branches for concealment. Their orders were simple, clear, and absolute. Observe enemy movements. Report back by radio. Do not engage unless directly attacked. Direct confrontation with the superior German force was deemed suicidal. But James Miller had other ideas. The situation facing the American defenders of Bastogne was deteriorating by the hour. The weather conditions, a persistent low-hanging overcast, had prevented Allied aircraft from providing any air support or, just as critically, from dropping badly needed supplies. The dense cloud cover, which had persisted for nearly a week, created a battlefield shrouded in a perpetual, freezing twilight of fog, snow, and smoke. Temperatures had dropped to -25 degrees. This was a cold that attacked technology as much as men. Weapons jammed as their lubricants congealed. Batteries failed. Radios died. Frostbite had become as dangerous an enemy as the German forces themselves. Medical reports from the aid station in Bastogne indicated that for every 10 casualties from enemy fire, another 7 soldiers were being treated for severe, debilitating cold-related injuries. The German forces surrounding Bastogne were elite. They consisted primarily of elements from the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by the brilliant tank general Hasso von Manteuffel. This force included the elite 2nd Panzer Division and the formidable Panzer Lehr Division. These units were equipped with Panzer IV and Panther tanks, but they also brought with them a substantial number of the dreaded Tiger tanks, massive 88-ton machines whose 88mm guns could destroy an American Sherman tank from over a mile away. The German infantry included both regular Wehrmacht soldiers and fanatical, battle-hardened Waffen-SS troops, many of whom had been fighting on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. Their experience in brutal winter warfare gave them a significant advantage over the American defenders, many of whom were from warmer southern states and had never experienced such extreme cold. Intelligence reports collected by the 101st's S2 section painted a grim picture. The German forces had been reinforced with fresh troops and, critically, resupplied with additional fuel and ammunition. The American defenders, meanwhile, were running dangerously low on both. Field hospitals inside Bastogne, set up in bombed-out churches and cellars, were overwhelmed with wounded. Medical supplies, particularly plasma and morphine, were critically scarce. The civilian population of Bastogne, approximately 3,000 Belgian citizens who had been unable to evacuate before the German encirclement, further complicated the situation. They required food and shelter, draining the already limited American supplies. Some civilians had heroically offered their homes to American soldiers, providing a brief, precious respite from the cold, while others assisted with caring for the wounded. Yet the presence of civilians also restricted the Americans' defensive options, particularly regarding the use of artillery fire within the town itself. The overall strategic situation of the Battle of the Bulge had evolved into a desperate race against time. General Eisenhower, seeing the crisis, had ordered General George Patton's Third Army to pivot 90 degrees and attack north to relieve the surrounded defenders of Bastogne. But the fastest Patton's forces, fighting through blizzard conditions and entrenched German resistance, could possibly arrive was December 26th. This was potentially too late. Every hour that the 101st Airborne could hold out, every hour they could keep those 7 roads out of German hands, was crucial for the broader Allied effort to contain and defeat the German offensive. This was the context in which Sergeant James Miller found himself on that fateful December 23rd. From his observation post, he could see the German forces preparing for what appeared to be the main assault. Through his binoculars, he observed German officers gathering around maps spread on the hood of a command vehicle. Artillery units were being positioned, their 88mm guns capable of reducing Bastogne's defenses to rubble. Most concerning were the Panzer tanks. Miller counted at least 15 of them being refueled and checked by their crews. Intercepted radio transmissions and intelligence from prisoners had revealed a chilling fact. The German forces believed the American defenders to be on the verge of collapse. The German command fully expected Bastogne to fall within 24 hours. The mood among the American defenders was somber but determined. General McAuliffe had issued orders for each unit to hold their positions at all costs, famously telling his officers, "We are giving our country and our loved ones at home a worthy Christmas present." But words of inspiration could not change the mathematical reality of the situation. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. The specific sector that Sergeant Miller was observing had been identified by command as particularly vulnerable. Only 117 combat-effective soldiers from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment were defending a stretch of land that would normally require at least 400 men. Their heavy weapons support was a joke. They had exactly 2 operational 50-caliber machine guns, 3 bazooka teams with a total of 7 rockets between them, and each infantryman carried an average of just 65 rounds of ammunition. Against this meager, freezing force, intelligence estimated that the Germans would send at least 1,000 infantry supported by 20 tanks. The mathematics of the situation were brutally clear. Without reinforcement or a radical change in circumstances, this section of the perimeter would be overrun, potentially leading to the collapse of Bastogne's entire northwestern defense. In the 3 days leading up to December 23rd, during every spare moment of quiet, Sergeant Miller had been working. He had been working on his rifle. The standard M1 Garand rifle was a revolutionary weapon. It was the first semi-automatic rifle to be widely issued as standard infantry equipment, giving American soldiers a significant advantage in firepower over their German counterparts, who were largely armed with the bolt-action Kar 98K. But this groundbreaking weapon, in Miller's opinion, had limitations, and these limitations frustrated him. Chief among these was the trigger reset mechanism. To fire a second shot, the M1 Garand required the trigger to be fully released, allowing the mechanism to reset. While this was a crucial safety feature designed to prevent accidental discharges and slam fires, it also limited the theoretical rate of fire. The Garand was designed to fire no more than 30 rounds per minute in sustained combat conditions. This was a rate that James Miller, the boy who fixed rifles with sewing needles, believed could be doubled. The modifications Miller had been making in that frozen foxhole were subtle, secret, and significant. Using a small metal file he kept in his pocket and a tiny high-tension spring salvaged from a broken watch, he had carefully, meticulously altered the sear engagement surfaces within the trigger housing group. He polished the contact points to reduce friction. He modified the disconnector, the very piece that forced the trigger to be fully released. These changes, wrought by frozen fingers in the Belgian twilight, created what he called a hair trigger with rapid reset. Essentially, he had engineered his rifle to allow the trigger to be pulled again after moving forward just 1/8 of an inch, rather than having to return to its original position. This modification created a trigger that could be bumped or tapped in rapid succession, dramatically increasing the rate of fire, without, crucially, converting the weapon to fully automatic. Such modifications were explicitly, and for very good reason, forbidden by Army regulations. The regulations against such tampering were not arbitrary. First, unauthorized modifications could potentially damage the complex internal mechanism of the rifle or cause it to jam at a critical moment. Second, they made the weapon less safe, dramatically increasing the risk of an accidental discharge. A weapon with a hair trigger in the hands of a cold, exhausted, glove-wearing soldier was a recipe for disaster. Third, and perhaps most importantly from the Army's perspective in Bastogne, these modifications dramatically increased ammunition consumption. In a siege situation where every single round was precious, a weapon that encouraged rapid firing was a logistical liability. The legend of James Miller, however, is built on a different reality. The story holds that Miller had kept his modifications secret from most of his fellow soldiers. But he had, according to the tale, cautiously demonstrated the altered rifle to his friend, Corporal Jenkins, just 1 day earlier during a brief patrol. Jenkins, like Sergeant Cooper before him, had been skeptical. That is, until Miller took aim at a fallen tree trunk 200 yards away and fired 6 rounds in less than 2 seconds. All 6 rounds hit the trunk. "Jesus, Jimmy," Jenkins had whispered, his eyes wide, "that's not a Garand anymore, that's a damn machine gun." Miller had sworn Jenkins to secrecy, knowing that if word of his modification reached command, he would face severe disciplinary action, even in the midst of a siege. What Miller didn't reveal, even to Jenkins, was that he had been working on this modification since Normandy, refining it through countless hours of trial and error. He had tested it during the heavy combat in Holland during Operation Market Garden, using it to engage a German machine gun nest that had pinned down his squad. In the chaos of that battle, no one had questioned how he had managed to fire so rapidly. That engagement had convinced Miller that his modification, his violation of regulations, could save American lives if used at the right moment. On the morning of December 23, 1944, that moment arrived. But what was this forbidden modification? What had Sergeant Miller, the clockwork soldier, actually done to his rifle? The legend describes a brilliant, intuitive hack, a simple adjustment that turned a standard rifle into a precision instrument of rapid fire. The declassified technical files and the harsh realities of mechanical engineering tell a different and far more dangerous story. The modification that soldiers sometimes attempted in the field was not a sophisticated rapid reset. It was a crude, desperate, and exceptionally dangerous act. There are anecdotal reports from other units, such as the 87th Mountain Infantry, of soldiers discovering it was very easy to convert a semi-automatic M1 Garand to full automatic fire. This was achieved by doing exactly what Miller was supposedly disciplined for in basic training: filing down the trigger group components, specifically the sear and the trigger mechanism. Let's examine the mechanics. In a standard M1 Garand, when the trigger is pulled and a round is fired, the action cycles. If the soldier keeps the trigger held back, the sear, a critical piece of the trigger group, is designed to catch the hammer on its rear hooks, holding it in the cocked position. The rifle cannot fire until the soldier releases the trigger, which allows the sear to disengage and the trigger lugs to re-engage the hammer, making it ready for the next pull. This is the very definition of semi-automatic fire. The crude field modification, the hack, involved filing or wearing down those precise contact points on the sear and hammer. By removing this material, the mechanism's ability to catch the hammer was destroyed. The result was not a controllable rapid reset. The result was an uncontrollable runaway gun. When the trigger was pulled, the rifle would fire, the action would cycle, and because the damaged sear could no longer hold the hammer back, the hammer would follow the bolt forward, firing the next round immediately. This would continue in an uncontrollable, high-speed burst until the 8-round clip was empty. Soldiers who attempted this reported the rifle would fire uncontrollably, sometimes emptying the clip in less than a second, and that the original trigger and sear were so worn down by this violent, unintended action that they had to be completely replaced by an armorer. This runaway state is mechanically different from a slam fire, another critical danger of a modified M1. A slam fire is an unintentional discharge that happens when the bolt closes without the trigger being pulled. This is often caused by a high or sensitive ammunition primer, or a firing pin stuck forward with frozen grease or dirt. An out-of-battery slam fire, where the round ignites before the bolt is fully locked, is catastrophic. It can shatter the rifle's stock, blow the entire trigger housing out of the weapon, and shear off the bolt's locking lugs, turning the rifle into a grenade in the soldier's hands. This is why such modifications were banned. Army regulations, specifically Field Manual 23-5, strictly prohibited any alteration to the rifle by the soldier. The disassembly of parts crucial to the firing mechanism, such as the sear from the trigger, was authorized only to be performed by trained ordnance personnel. The minimum safe trigger pull for an M1 was set at 4.5 pounds. Any modification that lightened this, especially filing to sear engagement, risked creating an unsafe weapon prone to both runaway fire and catastrophic slam fires. Furthermore, there was the simple, brutal reality of the 30-06 cartridge. This was a powerful, full-sized rifle round. Firing it in a fully automatic mode from a light 9-pound infantry rifle was physically punishing and practically uncontrollable. Official Ordnance Department tests of their own selective-fire prototypes, which we will examine, revealed extreme issues with recoil, muzzle blast, and climb. The experience was jokingly and accurately compared to holding on to a lit rodeo bull. Winchester's early attempts at a selective-fire Garand resulted in uncontrollable cyclic rates of over 900 rounds per minute. And then there was the heat. Full automatic fire generated so much heat that it created a severe risk of cook-off, where the chamber became so hot that it would spontaneously ignite a round as soon as it was chambered, with or without the trigger being pulled. So, the legend of Sergeant Miller's hair trigger presents us with a paradox. Was it a work of ingenious, intuitive engineering, or was it a crude, dangerous modification that created an uncontrollable runaway gun? The legend is compelling. But could a reliable, controllable, selective-fire M1 Garand have even existed? The answer is yes, but it was not the work of a lone soldier with a watch spring. Starting in 1944, the U.S. Ordnance Department and Springfield Armory, the very engineers Sergeant Cooper revered, were deep into the development of a selective-fire M1 variant. This was the T-20 series. But to achieve what the Miller legend describes, the required modifications were vastly more complex than a simple sear filing. To convert the M1 from semi-automatic to a reliable, controlled, selective-fire weapon, engineers had to add entirely new components. A connector assembly was designed, which was actuated by the operating rod handle. This connector, in turn, actuated a sear release or trip. When the selector was set to automatic and the trigger held back, this trip mechanism would disengage the sear from the hammer only after the bolt was fully locked in battery, allowing the next round to fire instantly and safely. This was a sophisticated, timed mechanism, not a hammer-follow runaway. But the T-20 program immediately hit a massive wall: the feeding system. The greatest technical challenge was not the trigger, it was converting the M1 from its 8-round en-bloc clip system to a detachable magazine necessary for sustained automatic fire. Initial attempts to use the standard 20-round bar magazine failed spectacularly. The M1's action cycled too fast. The relatively light M1 bolt did not stay open long enough for the heavy spring and column of cartridges in the bar magazine to rise sufficiently for reliable feeding. The result was a catastrophic series of jams. To compensate for this mechanical timing issue, John Garand himself, the rifle's inventor, determined that the rear portion of the M1's receiver had to be lengthened by over 1/4 of an inch on the prototypes. This required a completely new, redesigned receiver. The final, functional version, the T-20E2, required its own proprietary 20-round magazine to work reliably. And to control the lit rodeo bull of full-auto 30-06 fire, the T-20E2 was fitted with a muzzle brake to reduce recoil and muzzle climb, a bipod to enhance control, and 2 heat-flow arresting grooves machined into the barrel just before the chamber to help disperse the incredible heat and reduce the incidence of cook-off. This is the declassified reality. Turning an M1 Garand into a reliable, controlled automatic weapon during World War II required changes to the entire weapon system: a new, lengthened receiver, a redesigned selective-fire trigger mechanism with new parts, and a new proprietary detachable magazine system. The legend of Sergeant James Miller, a man who supposedly achieved this with a file and a watch spring, all while feeding from standard 8-round clips in a standard receiver, becomes, under this technical scrutiny, mechanically impossible. The weapon he supposedly created, if he filed that sear, would not have been a precision tool. It would have been an uncontrollable, unreliable 8-round runaway gun that would have shaken itself to pieces and likely jammed after the first burst. And yet, the legend persists. It persists because of what happened on that ridge on December 23rd. At precisely 0700 hours, the German artillery opened fire. The barrage was focused accurate, and terrifying, concentrating on the northwestern sector where Miller, Jenkins, and Rodriguez were positioned. For 30 agonizing minutes, shells rained down. The concussive force of their explosions sent geysers of snow and frozen earth erupting into the air. The three men huddled in their foxhole, the log covering providing minimal protection from shrapnel, but none from the bone-jarring impacts that seemed to compress their very lungs with each explosion. When the artillery ceased, an eerie, profound silence fell over the battlefield. It was broken only by the distant moans of wounded men and the creaking of tree branches, heavy with snow. Then came the sound, the distinctive, low, mechanical growl of tank engines warming up, a sound that grew steadily louder. Miller peered cautiously over the edge of his foxhole. Through a break in the trees, he could see them. German tanks emerging from the tree line approximately 900 yards away. Behind them, the infantry advanced in disciplined formation, their field gray uniforms barely visible against the snow. Miller's radio crackled to life. It was Captain William Harrison, commander of Charlie Company. Eagle Nest to all forward observers. Report enemy movements, but maintain position. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Conserve ammunition for close defense. Miller keyed his radio, his voice strained. Eagle Nest, this is Watchdog 3. Observing approximately 15 Panzer tanks and 300 infantry advancing on grid Baker 7. They'll reach our forward line in approximately 20 minutes at current pace. Over. There was a long pause before Captain Harrison's voice returned, the strain unmistakable. Acknowledged, Watchdog 3. Continue observation. Battalion is aware of the situation. Help is on the way. Over. Miller exchanged a dark glance with Jenkins and Rodriguez. They all recognized the lie in Harrison's last statement. It was the lie all commanders tell. No help was coming. Not in 20 minutes. Not in time. Miller made his decision. He turned to the young private. Rodriguez, I need you to run. Run back to Captain Harrison's position. Tell him our radio is damaged and we can't communicate. Tell him we're staying to observe but may need to relocate due to enemy movement. Go now. The young private looked confused, his face a mask of fear and incomprehension. But, Sergeant, the radio is working fine. Miller's voice dropped to a cold, hard whisper. The radio will be broken as soon as you leave. Now go. That's an order. As Rodriguez reluctantly departed, crawling backward through a shallow communication trench, Jenkins turned to Miller. His eyes, framed by the rim of his helmet, were steady. What are you planning, Clockwork? Miller was already repositioning himself at the edge of the foxhole. His modified Garand, the legend says, was resting on a fallen log, a stable platform that provided both support and concealment. I'm going to create a diversion, buy our guys some time. Jenkins's eyes widened as the suicidal reality of the plan dawned on him. With one rifle against 15 tanks and 300 men? That's not a diversion, Jimmy. That's suicide. Miller didn't look away from his scope as he replied, Not if they don't know where the fire is coming from. Not if they don't know how many of us there are. According to the story, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another small metal object, handing it to Jenkins. I made this, too. It was a deflector, a crude cone of metal, seemingly hammered into shape, designed to fit over the muzzle of the rifle. It changes the sound of the rifle, Miller explained, makes it echo, makes it sound like it's coming from multiple locations. Jenkins examined the crude device, his skepticism warring with a desperate hope. Jesus, Jimmy, when do you sleep? I'll sleep when we get home, Miller replied, already focusing on his first target. It was a German officer, standing exposed in the turret of the lead Panzer, binoculars raised as he surveyed the American lines. The distance was approximately 850 yards. It was a challenging shot under ideal conditions, a nearly impossible one in the swirling snow with a standard infantry rifle. But Miller, the story goes, had also modified his sights, and he had been making impossible shots since his childhood in Ohio. "If I can take out their officers and radio operators, it will slow their advance," Miller explained, his voice a low, calm monotone. "They'll have to reorganize. They might even change their attack plan. That buys our line maybe an hour to better prepare. An hour could make all the difference." Jenkins hesitated for only a second before making his decision. He picked up his own binoculars. "I'll spot for you. What's our signal to bug out if they start zeroing in on us?" Miller allowed himself a grim, fleeting smile. "3 short clicks on the radio, but we hold as long as possible." As the German forces continued their methodical advance through the snow-covered field, Sergeant Miller took a deep breath, exhaled halfway, and gently, with the sensitivity of a watchmaker, squeezed his modified trigger. The rifle barked. The sound, according to the legend, was altered and amplified by the makeshift deflector, a sharp crack that echoed strangely off the frozen trees. 850 yards away, the German officer in the lead tank suddenly slumped forward, vanishing into the turret. Through his scope, Miller could see confusion rippling through the German ranks. Before they could react, he rapidly fired 5 more shots. 5 shots in less than 3 seconds. An impossible rate of fire for a standard M1 Garand. 5 more German soldiers fell, including what appeared to be 2 radio operators and another officer. The modified trigger, the legend claims, was performing exactly as he had hoped, allowing him to fire with a speed that mimicked a light machine gun rather than a semi-automatic rifle. The effect on the German advance was immediate and dramatic. The infantry, trained to react instantly to machine gun fire, instinctively dove for cover, their neat, disciplined formations disintegrating into chaos. The tanks halted, their commanders, suddenly uncertain of the location or the strength of the American position firing upon them, buttoned up. Through his scope, Miller could see German officers gesturing frantically, trying to reorganize their forces. Some pointed in Miller's general direction, but others, confused by the strange echo, indicated completely different locations. The sound deflector was working. "They think they're facing a whole company," Jenkins whispered, his voice filled with incredulity as he observed the German confusion through his binoculars. "Maybe even multiple machine gun nests." Miller didn't respond. He was already lining up his next series of targets. As a group of German soldiers attempted to move to a flanking position, he fired another rapid sequence. 7 rounds in under 4 seconds. 4 more Germans fell, and the rest scrambled back to their original positions. For the next 20 minutes, Miller continued this pattern. He fired in short, rapid, precise bursts, then changed position slightly within the foxhole, sliding a few feet to the left or right to further confuse the German forces about his location. Jenkins continued to spot targets, whispering coordinates and estimated distances. The modified Garand, the story says, performed flawlessly, allowing Miller to maintain a rate of fire that should have been impossible. The effect on the German advance was devastating. Not primarily in terms of casualties. Miller had perhaps eliminated 20 German soldiers out of 300. The true damage was to their momentum, their organization, and their command structure. The precise, rapid targeting of officers and radio operators had severed the German chain of command, leaving units isolated and unsure of their objectives. The tanks, without clear infantry support, were hesitant to advance further into what they now believed was a heavily defended, heavily fortified section of the American line. The German forces, their initial assault broken by a single, unseen, and impossibly fast rifle, began to withdraw to the tree line, apparently to regroup and reconsider their entire approach. As Miller paused to reload, Jenkins keyed the radio, knowing it was dead. Watchdog 3 to Eagle Nest. Enemy forces withdrawing to original positions. Estimate delay of at least 30 minutes, possibly more. Over. There was no response. Miller had indeed disabled the radio after Rodriguez's departure. But the message was a reminder of what they had accomplished. They had bought the American defenders precious, irreplaceable time. Miller allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before reality reasserted itself. "They'll be back," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "And they'll bring more artillery to soften us up first. We need to relocate." The two men quickly gathered their equipment, being careful to leave no evidence of their presence. As they prepared to move to a secondary position approximately 300 yards to the southeast, Miller took one last look through his scope at the retreating German forces. What he saw chilled him. A group of German soldiers with distinctive uniform markings, Feld Gendarmerie, the military police, with training in forensic battlefield analysis, were already examining the area where his bullets had struck. They were analyzing the angles, already beginning to determine the true source of the fire. "We move now," Miller whispered urgently to Jenkins. "They're tracking our shots." As they crawled away from their position, the first German artillery shells began to fall, not in a general barrage, but with uncanny, terrifying precision, directly on the foxhole they had just abandoned. The Germans had indeed calculated the source of the fire and were now determined to eliminate it. What they didn't realize was that their target was already on the move, preparing to disrupt their next advance from an entirely different location. This is the climax of the legend. But let us pause and deconstruct this engagement with the cold, hard lens of history. First, the sound deflector. Did such a device exist? The historical records of the 101st Airborne in Bastogne mention no such specialized deflector. However, the concept of using sound for deception was a known practice. U.S. Army field manuals of the time detailed a tactic called fixed very rapid fire, where a soldier with an M1 Garand would fire as quickly as possible to give the appearance that a machine gun or automatic rifle is firing, thereby deceiving the enemy as to American strength. Furthermore, soldiers were known to create improvised field modifications. Field-made flash hiders were fashioned for the M1 rifle using empty .50 caliber cartridge cases. So, while a specific sound deflector is undocumented, the concept of using gunfire for tactical deception and the practice of field-modifying muzzle devices are both historically plausible. But the second, and more critical element, is the German reaction. Did they really mistake a single rifleman for multiple machine gun nests? The answer, incredibly, is yes. But the declassified records reveal a truth far more profound than the Miller legend. The Germans weren't confused by a modified rifle. They were confused by the standard M1 Garand. German after-action reports and captured documents from the Battle of the Bulge are filled with shocked observations about the unusually high volume of small arms fire from American infantry positions. A captured German training circular issued in December 1944 to prepare troops for facing Americans explicitly instructed, enemy riflemen must be considered as automatic weapon operators. It further warned German soldiers to expect continuous fire from all enemy positions. An operations order captured from the 12th SS Panzer Division stated that American small arms fire prevents movement even with numerical superiority, and mandated that each enemy position must be treated as automatic weapon emplacement. General Hasso von Manteuffel, the commander of the 5th Panzer Army besieging Bastogne, acknowledged this in his post-war memoirs. He stated that the American semi-automatic rifle provided their infantry with a decisive advantage, noting that German forces, armed with their bolt-action rifles, simply could not generate sufficient suppressive fire to enable movement. German soldiers, used to the crack-pause crack of their own Kar 98K rifles, were terrified by the sustained roar of semi-automatic fire that didn't stop coming from the American lines. The impossible effect that Sergeant Miller supposedly achieved with his machine gun Garand was, in fact, the standard operating performance of the M1 rifle. The sound that the Germans mistook for multiple machine guns was simply the sound of well-trained American infantrymen firing their standard-issue rifles as fast as they could pull the trigger. This historical fact introduces fatal flaws into the very core of the Miller legend. Flaw number 1, ammunition. The legend has Miller firing in rapid, multi-shot bursts, expending over 170 rounds in a few hours. But the single most critical problem in Bastogne was a severe ammunition shortage. The defenders were starving for supplies. By December 23rd, some artillery units were down to 10 rounds per gun. In the 506th Parachute Infantry sector, men were virtually out of ammunition. One company reported having only one bandolier, just 48 rounds for each rifleman. Strict orders had been issued to ration all ammunition. In this context, a soldier who had modified his rifle into an uncontrollable runaway gun with a cyclic rate of 900 rounds per minute would not have been a hero. He would have been a logistical menace, a man wasting precious, irreplaceable ammunition in unaimed, panicked bursts. The very act of the modification was antithetical to the tactical reality of the siege. Flaw number 2. The cold. The temperature was -25 degrees. At this temperature, standard rifle lubricant, rifle bore cleaner, and grease congeal. They turn from a lubricant into a thick, resistant glue. This was a notorious problem, causing the actions of all weapons, machine guns, rifles, and pistols, to become sluggish, leading to failures to feed and eject. Now consider the two versions of Miller's rifle. The legend's rapid reset hair trigger would require near-perfect mechanical timing. The declassified runaway gun modification, which relied on the hammer following the bolt, would be even more susceptible to timing failures. Introduce a sluggish, freezing, half-frozen action to either of these delicate, unauthorized modifications, and the result is not a superweapon. The result is a guaranteed, catastrophic jam. Or worse, a filed-down sear combined with a bolt that fails to lock fully due to the cold. This creates the perfect conditions for an out-of-battery detonation. The rifle would have exploded in his face. Flaw number 3. The role. The legend calls Miller a designated marksman, a role synonymous with precision. A sniper or marksman's entire discipline is built around precise trigger control. They are trained to squeeze the trigger so steadily that the moment the hammer falls is a surprise, preventing flinching. An uncontrollable, rapid-firing modification is the antithesis of this discipline. It sacrifices all accuracy for a volume of fire that a marksman, whose job is one shot, one kill, would never need or want. The legend of Sergeant James Miller, the farm boy who out-engineered the U.S. Army, begins to unravel. But the story continues. According to the legend, Sergeant Miller and Corporal Jenkins spent the next 2 hours executing a brilliant sequence of shoot-and-move tactics. They would fire from a position for no more than 5 minutes, just long enough to disrupt the German attempts to reorganize, but not long enough for the Germans to calculate their location and direct artillery fire effectively. Throughout this period, the German forces, now believing they were facing a heavily defended sector with multiple automatic weapons, made 3 separate, tentative attempts to advance. Each time, they were forced to pull back due to the uncanny accuracy and shocking volume of fire from Miller's rifle. The psychological impact was complete. German infantry were now hesitant to advance, even with tank support. By midday, Miller had supposedly expended nearly 170 rounds. The modified trigger mechanism, the legend admits, was beginning to show signs of wear, occasionally sticking. His shoulder was badly bruised, and his trigger finger was bleeding from the cold metal. But the northwest sector, which had been identified as the most vulnerable point in Bastogne's perimeter, remained intact. The delay, the story claims, had allowed Captain Harrison to reposition his limited forces, concentrating them at the most likely points of breakthrough. More importantly, the unexpected resistance had forced the German commanders to reconsider their entire approach, diverting resources away from this main thrust. At 1300 hours, Miller and Jenkins returned to the American lines, slipping through a drainage culvert. They were immediately taken to Captain Harrison's command post, a collapsed stone farmhouse. Harrison's reaction, the legend says, was a mixture of anger, disbelief, and reluctant admiration. "You disobeyed a direct order, Sergeant," he began, his voice low and intense. "You were explicitly instructed not to engage." Before Miller could respond, Harrison continued, "And thank God you did. Whatever you did out there bought us critical time. Battalion just received word that Patton's forces have broken through south of here. They should reach us within 48 hours, if we can hold out." Jenkins, the story goes, spoke up. "Sir, you should see what Miller did to his rifle. It's like nothing I've ever seen." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Modified your weapon, did you? Let me see it." Miller hesitantly handed over his Garand. Harrison, who, in a convenient narrative twist, had been an armorer before receiving his commission, examined it carefully. His expression shifted from skepticism to astonishment. "This is ingenious," he said. "Completely against regulations, potentially dangerous, and absolutely brilliant. How many rounds did you fire today, and how quickly?" 173 rounds, sir," Miller replied, "in bursts of 5 to 7 rounds, each burst taking between 2 and 4 seconds. Harrison shook his head in amazement. "That's not possible with a standard Garand. The enemy must have thought they were facing at least a platoon with multiple automatic weapons." "Fix whatever's wearing out. You may need it again before this is over." The expected German counterattack came at dawn on December 24th, Christmas Eve. This time, they committed even greater resources, 37 tanks and nearly 1,000 infantry concentrated on a 2-mile front. Their artillery preparation was the heaviest yet. But the American defenses, the legend concludes, had been significantly reinforced during the time Miller's actions had bought them. Additional .50 caliber machine guns had been brought up, ammunition had been redistributed, and anti-tank teams had been perfectly positioned. More importantly, the defenders now had hope. Miller and Jenkins were positioned on the second floor of an abandoned farmhouse, 400 yards behind the forward line. From this elevated position, Miller had exceptional fields of fire. Captain Harrison had given him explicit orders. This time, target officers, radio operators, and anti-tank teams. Make every shot count. As the German tanks advanced, the American defenders held their fire until the last moment. In the chaos of the battle, Miller's modified Garand once again proved devastatingly effective. He focused on German officers and specialized troops. When a German anti-tank team set up to target an American position, Miller, the story claims, eliminated all 3 crew members in less than 2 seconds, a feat impossible with a standard rifle. For 4 hours, the battle raged. 3 times the Germans penetrated the perimeter, and 3 times they were driven back. Throughout it all, Miller's rifle continued to strike at critical points, its unusual rate of fire creating the impression of multiple automatic weapons. By mid-afternoon, the German attack faltered. Their losses had been severe: 14 tanks destroyed and an estimated 300 casualties. The American line, though battered, remained intact. As the Germans withdrew, a new sound filled the air: the rumble of American aircraft. The weather had cleared. C-47 transport planes began dropping supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, and winter clothing. The psychological effect was enormous. The German commanders, seeing the American air support and knowing Patton was approaching from the south, redirected their main effort. The massive breakthrough they had planned for the northwest sector would not be attempted again. On December 26th, the first elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through, effectively ending the siege. The defense of Bastogne, one of the decisive actions of the war, was over. In the chaos and jubilation of the relief, the specific actions of individual soldiers were, as the legend accurately notes, often overlooked. Captain Harrison's after-action report, the story claims, was deliberately vague. It mentioned only exceptional marksmanship by forward observers that disrupted enemy advances, with no specific mention of Sergeant Miller or his modified rifle. Harrison recognized that drawing attention to an unauthorized weapon modification, regardless of its effectiveness, could result in a court-martial, not a medal. But word spread. Soldiers began to refer to Miller as Machine Gun Miller, a nickname that acknowledged his achievement. Officers who knew the truth, the story says, generally looked the other way. In wartime, results often mattered more than regulations. The legend culminates in a final, powerful anecdote. On January 3, 1945, General McAuliffe himself, the man who had replied, "Nuts," visited the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. During this visit, he spoke briefly with Sergeant Miller, who had been pointed out by Captain Harrison. Their conversation was not recorded, but according to witnesses, McAuliffe simply asked to see Miller's rifle. He examined it closely for nearly a minute, turning it over in his hands, then handed it back with a single comment. "Ingenious work, Sergeant. The Army could use more men who think like you." No official recognition, no medals. But among the men who were there, the legend says, the truth was known. An unauthorized modification to a standard M1 Garand helped save Bastogne. This is a perfect story. A story of American ingenuity, of disciplined initiative, of a humble hero. It is also almost entirely a fabrication. Let us return to the declassified files, to the hard, cold, primary source history. We have established the technical and logistical impossibilities. Now let us check the names. Sergeant James Miller, Charlie Company, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. The historical archives of the 101st Airborne Division, including detailed after-action reports and journals, contain no record of a Sergeant James Miller in the 502nd PIR during the defense of Bastogne. Captain William Harrison, commander of Charlie Company, 502nd PIR. The command rosters for the 502nd PIR in Bastogne are known. The regiment was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Steve A. Chapuis. The commander of A Company was Captain Swanson. The historical records contain no mention of a Captain William Harrison commanding Charlie Company. The very protagonists of this story, the hero and his supportive commander, do not appear to exist. But the legend, as told by the competitor, is detailed. It continues into the post-war years, weaving a tapestry of validation. The story goes that Miller was promoted and transferred to a specialized equipment evaluation unit. After the war, he returned to Millfield, Ohio, used the GI Bill to study mechanical engineering, and opened a successful machine shop. He married, had children, and, like many veterans, rarely spoke of the war. This changed, the legend claims, in 1969, with a reunion of the 502nd PIR. There, a retired Colonel William Harrison gave a speech, and for the first time publicly described Miller's modified rifle and its impact on the battle. This, the story says, led to a historian contacting Miller in 1972. The resulting book, Bastogne, The Critical Hours, published in 1974, supposedly included a full chapter on Miller's story, complete with technical diagrams. This, in turn, led to the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum creating an exhibit on his modification. The legend concludes with Miller writing his own memoir, completed in 1983. The title, Clockwork, A Soldier's Story. This, the final, verifiable piece. A book published in 1983 titled Clockwork, A Soldier's Story. We have checked the historical records, the Library of Congress, and all available publication databases. No such memoir exists. The title itself, however, is a fascinating clue. It appears to be a fabrication, a clever blending of two very real memoirs. General Omar Bradley's original war memoir, published in 1951, was titled A Soldier's Story. And in 1983, the exact year Miller's memoir was supposedly published, General Bradley's second memoir, A General's Life, was released. The legend of James Miller, Sergeant Clockwork, is a myth. It is a piece of compelling folklore, a war story woven together from disparate threads. The real-life existence of crude, runaway field modifications, the very real terror of the German army at the standard M1 Garand's rate of fire, and the fictional names of a hero, a commander, and a memoir, all designed to create a narrative of singular, unauthorized heroism. German after-action reports did reveal that their commanders believed they were facing multiple machine gun nests in the American sectors. But this misconception was not due to one man with a modified rifle. It was the result of every American rifleman in the 101st Airborne hunkered down in their frozen foxholes, armed with the greatest battle implement ever devised, and pouring a sustained roar of semi-automatic fire into the attacking German formations. The story of the band trigger modification that helped defend Bastogne is more than just a fascinating historical anecdote. It illuminates a broader truth. Official doctrine and equipment, no matter how well designed, cannot anticipate all battlefield conditions. But the true story here is not one of a lone genius breaking the rules. The true story is, perhaps, even more impressive. It is the story of an army that had the industrial power and the foresight to equip every single one of its infantrymen with a technologically superior, rugged, and rapid-firing semi-automatic rifle. The hero of this story is not Sergeant James Miller. The hero is the M1 Garand itself, and the anonymous thousands of Screaming Eagles who used it, as issued, to hold the line. The mathematics of war are often brutal and unforgiving. The legend of James Clockwork Miller is a comforting reminder that human innovation and courage can sometimes defy those cold calculations. But the declassified truth is that the ripples from those frozen days in Bastogne were not created by one man's unauthorized modification. They were created by an entire division's unbreakable courage, and by the roar of thousands of standard-issue rifles, a sound so overwhelming that the enemy mistook every single American soldier for a machine gunner.